He had also sent a message to the United States, underlining Britain's will to fight and the strength of its leader. With the nation behind him, Winston Churchill had finally achieved his lifelong quest for power. Now he had to translate power into victory. His war cabinet was organized to give him maximum control. He appointed himself Minister of Defense. Churchill was a hard taskmaster. His excessive demands and sharp temper asked much of those around him.
And he came behind me to see how I was getting on. And he said at once, "What are you doing it like that for?" So now this time I was scared. I sat up very straight and said, "Mr. Churchill, I've made a mistake, but I wasn't going to blame the machine." And then he was very cross and he sent me out. And someone else had to get up from sleeping in the shelter and come and do his work.
Clementine was becoming concerned about his increasing bullying. She wrote him a personal note, begging him to behave more reasonably.
My darling, I hope you will forgive me if I tell you something that I feel you ought to know. There is a danger of you being disliked by your colleagues and subordinates because of your rough, sarcastic, and overbearing manner. I must confess that I have noticed a deterioration. You are not so kind as you used to be. With this terrific power, you must combine kindness and calm. I cannot bear that those who serve the country and yourself should not love you as well as admire and respect you. Please forgive your loving, devoted, and watchful Clemmy.
And nobody liked being ticked off, and it was always quite a harsh tick, too. But one knew that he was bearing the weight of the war at that stage entirely alone. And one had to just do what one could to perform his work the way he wanted it.
In the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain raged in the skies over southern England. During the struggle, Churchill was the voice of what he called the lion-hearted British people, and said that through his speeches, he was able to give the lion its roar.
According to his private secretary, John Colton, he would invest 1 hour of preparation for every minute of delivery. And so for a major set-piece speech in the House of Commons, running to 45 or 50 minutes, we're talking of 45 or 50 hours of preparation while fighting Hitler at the same time.
He instructed me to go outside and get some fresh air into my lungs because we were going to work late that night. So I did that. And I sat down and waited. And then he got up and he started dictating.
The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, goes out to the British Airmen, who, undaunted by odds...
And I wrote and wrote and wrote, and he went on, and he walked round the table and round the table.
By their prowess and by their devotion.
And I didn't interfere in any way. I didn't ask anything. What did you say? Because I could see he was in full flight.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. All hearts go out to the fighter pilots, whose brilliant actions we see with our own eyes day after day. But we must never forget. Night after night, our bomber squadrons travel past...
Sometimes his voice would drop half an octave and there'd be a harsh note. That bad man, when speaking of Hitler.
We cannot tell what lies ahead. It may be that even greater ordeals lie before us. We shall face whatever...
And I can remember now, I sat there writing and writing and thinking, oh my goodness, let me get all this down. And we went on and on and on. And after a bit, he swung round on me and he said, "Are you tired?" I said, no, I'm not tired, because I was getting steamed up too, you see. And he said, "We must go on and on like the gun horses till we drop."
Finding themselves alone, stood undismayed against disaster. No one flinch is the noblest prize of victory. We are still toiling, I hope, indeed, I pray, looking out upon the future. Like the Mississippi, it just keeps rolling on. All good men, let it roll. All free men, let it roll on full flood. Inexorable, irresistible, benign, to broader lands and better.
And then the time went on and I heard a sleepy note coming in his voice. And then all of a sudden he dropped all the histrionics and he sounded quite dead level again, and he said, "Oh well, that's enough for tonight. Now you can go to bed. It was 4:30. You needn't type that out tonight. You can do it in the morning." I thought that was very kind of him.
Through his speeches, Churchill galvanized the nation, idealizing its glorious past.
He never kidded people along. I think one of the things, he always, nearly all his speeches say we've got a rough time ahead, but this has happened and that's a good thing. And I think that was a very important aspect of it. And of course I used to be glued to the radio listening to his speeches.
Every man and woman will therefore prepare himself to do his duty, whatever it may be.
Despite victory in the Battle of Britain, massive German bombing raids soon began to terrorize Britain's cities.
These cruel, wanton, indiscriminate bombings of London are, of course, a part of Hitler's invasion plan.
One evening, on the way to King's Cross, the sirens sounded. An autumn mist and drizzle shrouded the scene. The air was cold and raw. I felt, with a spasm of mental pain, a deep sense of the strain and suffering that was being borne. How long would it go on? How much would they have to bear?
Since 1940, Churchill had been appealing to the United States to enter the war, but in vain. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombing of the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor forced America's hand. Britain finally had its desperately needed Atlantic ally. Churchill and US President Franklin Roosevelt had held their first formal meeting 4 months before Pearl Harbor in August 1941. The two leaders immediately warmed to one another. Eleanor Roosevelt.
He had met Mr. Churchill before, but had not really known him. He felt that this meeting had broken the ice, and said he knew now that Churchill, whom he thought was typical John Bull, was a man with whom he could really work.
Churchill was equally impressed by Roosevelt.
I have formed the very highest regard and admiration for the President.
Churchill and his family were frequent visitors to the White House.
The valet came along to my room to say the Prime Minister wants to dictate and he's in the bathroom and would you go along? So I went along and there he was, like a big porpoise or something in a bath, going up and down in the water, you know, and he said, I'll dictate. So he started dictating and in between the splashes and all this sort of thing. And then he got out of the bath and there was a rat-a-tat-tat on the door. And he said, come in. He hated being interrupted. So he didn't say it in a very polite way, but in was wheeled President Roosevelt. And there was Winston by this time completely nude. He'd lost his bath towel. And the president, he said to the president, you see, Mr. President, I have nothing to hide from you.
But America's First Lady was not entirely won over by Churchill's extrovert personality.
I suppose I showed my concern about this at the time, and the Prime Minister probably remembered it when, on a later occasion in London, he said, "You don't really approve of me, do you, Mrs. Roosevelt?" Looking back on it, I don't suppose I really did. The cigars and the various favorite drinks had something to do with it.
Despite their friendship, the two men were poles apart politically. Roosevelt was a reforming liberal, Churchill an instinctive conservative. Roosevelt was strongly opposed to Churchill's dogged defense of the British Empire.
Franklin had never minced his words.